Hello, and welcome to this virtual event promoting gender equality and democracy. I'm Elan Verveer, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. We are thrilled to be hosting this important discussion in partnership with the Embassy of Sweden in the United States, which is under the able leadership of Ambassador Karin Olofsdotter. And we are so honored to be joined today by Sweden's dynamic foreign minister, who is leading her nation's commitment to a feminist foreign policy. Gender equality and democracy are mutually reinforcing. This is an evidence-based case. A democracy without the meaningful participation of women is a contradiction in terms. We've seen that countries with greater women's representation in elected office at all levels of government lead to more effective policy outcomes. Moreover, when women are discriminated against in the political sphere, their talents, experiences, and perspectives are shut out of political decisions, the very decisions that nevertheless affect them and their families. We are also seeing globally that when democracy comes under attack, so too does gender equality. Clearly, we have much to discuss today. I'm happy to welcome the more than 700 attendees who are with us on Zoom and the many more who are joining us on Facebook. From over 90 countries, a special welcome to each and every one of you. Just one reminder, we have already received many pre-submitted questions from our audience members. You will have an opportunity to submit questions throughout this discussion. Please submit your questions using the Q&A feature on your computer screen, either at the bottom or the side, and note your name, your affiliation, and to whom you are directing your question. And with that, I am delighted to introduce Foreign Minister Ann Linde, the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Sweden. She also serves as the Chairperson-in-Office for the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, where she has consistently underscored and acted on the organization's concept of comprehensive security, that political and economic security, human rights, democracy, the rule of law, and equality are interrelated and interconnected. Throughout her distinguished career in Swedish politics, she has held several positions in government, including Minister for Foreign Trade, Minister for Nordic Cooperation, Minister for European Affairs and Trade, European Union Affairs and Trade. Hers is a powerful voice for democracy, for human rights, for gender equality, both as Foreign Minister of Sweden and in her leadership role at the OSCE. In both of these, she has demonstrated an energetic commitment to these exceptionally important principles. Minister Linde, it is so great to have you with us today.
Thank you very, very much. And I'm so glad to be invited to this event. And thank you for allowing me to speak about an important issue that is close to my heart, promoting gender equality in democracy. It is really my big priority. I'm often asked why. Why does Sweden pursue a feminist foreign policy? And why has the Swedish government declared itself a feminist government? I think there are simple answers to these questions, because still, totally around the world, the daily life of women and girls are marked with bias, discrimination, and systematic subordination. And this situation has worsened during the pandemic. But also, to quote Vice President Kamala Harris, the status of woman is the status of democracy. All experiences speak to that more equal country is, the more stable and prosperous it is. Equality and democracy simply goes hand in hand. No democracy is flawless, but the ambition to constantly improve is important. We did not form a feminist government or a feminist foreign policy because we are perfect. We did it because we recognize that we all have a lot of work to do at home and abroad. Let me also from the outset say that I very much welcome President Biden's initiative to convey a summit for democracy. We need to stand up for our shared values, advance our shared interests, and demonstrate that democracy can deliver in face of new and accelerating global challenges. It is no secret that we see the current administration as an ally in this respect. The Biden-Harris administration has a clear reform agenda. Apart from being a security issue, women's economic empowerment is also key to sustainable development and economic growth. Developing and harnessing 1/2 of the world's available talent will have a huge impact on growth, competitiveness, and environmental sustainability of economies and business worldwide. The OSCE estimates that increasing female employment account for 10 to 20% of the overall average annual growth rate in Sweden and the Nordic countries over the past 50 years. And as we know by now, in societies where women are economically and politically emancipated, there is more peace and less violence. The Summit for Democracy could make a real difference by confirming the link between gender equality and democracy, mobilizing support for women's empowerment at the highest level. We believe this could be an area where concrete pledges could make a real difference. In pursuing a feminist foreign policy, Sweden has put gender equality and human rights on the top of our agenda at the very core of our foreign policy. I'm proud that Sweden has been part of establishing a feminist foreign policy as a new standard. We are now 6 countries, Canada, Luxembourg, France, Spain, Mexico, that are pursuing a foreign feminist policy, and several actors that are using the concept. Swedish feminist foreign policy has achieved significant results. I say this because sometimes it's dismissed as mere words. We have established a network of women mediators active all around the world. We have championed issues related to women, peace and security in the UN Security Council. We have campaigned for women's and girls' sexual and reproductive health and rights. We are active in a global coalition of economic and gender equality. And we have increased the representation of women in peace processes and legal systems in the world's largest online encyclopedia, Wikipedia. In addition, we have substantially increased our financial support to women rights defenders and activists around the world. In today's world, we see a lot of advancement when it comes to gender equality, but we also see setbacks. Personally, I'm particularly worried about the fact that COVID-19 is causing an outright recession for women and girls, with devastating long-term effects and consequences. I'm also worried about the pushback on women's and girls' human rights. Increasingly, we see systematic attacks against agreed language on gender equality, undermining not only language itself, but our possibilities to focus on the real problems at hand. And of course, at the top of our minds right now, the situation for women and girls in Afghanistan. To address the extremely challenging situation for women and girls in Afghanistan, we need an approach that is both broad and targeted. Finding ways to protect and uphold their rights and access to basic services will be difficult, but we need to find ways to work to support the Afghan people without legitimizing the Taliban takeover. In these efforts, we need a strong and coordinated United Nations on the ground, increased support to the grassroots movements and human rights defenders, including women's rights movement, is key. The situation in Afghanistan is and will continue to be a test for the international community. As the chairperson of the OSCE this year, my top priority is to defend the European security order and uphold the OSCE comprehensive concept of security. To achieve sustainable peace and development, we need our societies to be more inclusive. These include increased gender equality and not least the economic empowerment of women and girls. Therefore, Women, Peace and Security is a guiding theme of our chairpersonship. I've seen the importance of this agenda on ground in the conflict areas of the region, including Ukraine and the Caucasus. And I will continue to push for women to be included as actors in peace efforts. All too often they are not. I fully expect the Women, Peace and Security agenda to continue to be an important matter during the Swedish EU presidency in 2020 of negative global trends on democracy. Sweden launched in 2019 a Drive for Democracy, an initiative that is reflected in all areas of our foreign policy. And as a part of the Drive for Democracy, so-called democracy talks have been hosted by all our embassies all over the world. These activities have not only contributed to valuable platform for dialogue, but also directed increased attention to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, encouraged and supported defenders of democracy and human rights defenders, and promoted, among other things, the participation of young people and women. Dear friends, when rebuilding from the pandemic, we have a chance to make it right by integrating a gender analysis in our recovery packages, as well as in our public policy and budgeting. We know that women and girls are among those worst affected by the current pandemic. Sweden is a co-leader of a global action coalition on economic gender equality within the United Nations initiative Generation Equality. In this context and beyond, Sweden underlines how work for gender equality and women's economic empowerment must take place on a systematic and societal level. We need to build gender-responsive public governance systems and counteract discriminatory laws and policies. We must create gender-responsive and social protective systems, such as affordable childcare and parental leave, and we have to ensure women's equal access to productive employment. Cooperation and building alliances for gender equality and all women's and girls in full enjoyment of human rights have seldom been more important than right now. I'm convinced that we can go forward, learn from each other, and use the platform at our disposals. At the global level, we see great potential in collaborating both within the framework of generation equality and the regular United Nations processes, as well as in the international financial institution. And here I just have to say, just before this meeting, I was so happy because our finance minister, Ms. Magdalena Andersson, was nominated to be the new chairperson of the Social Democratic Party, and by that, a big chance of being the first female prime minister in Sweden. So many of us in Sweden are very happy today. But this means that we have to work on several fronts. We must level the playing field for women's political participation, locally, nationally, and internationally. We have to work on legislation and eliminate legal obstacles that hinder women's participation. We have to establish and promote independent institutions against discrimination, appoint gender-balanced representative bodies, and gender mainstreaming policies and budgets. And we must work on changing norms. And I will start to stop the intervention by saying, let's start and begin the work. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Minister. And your descriptions of feminist foreign policy have shown us just how valuable gender integration is at all levels, and also in multilateral work, as you pointed out in your work at the OSCE. You mentioned significant results of this policy. You also mentioned that there are worries in terms of the impacts of COVID, the pushback that is going on against gender equality, which we're all very familiar with, as well as the situation in Afghanistan and other trouble spots. I'm wondering if you could tease out a little bit more your views on what greater efforts we all need to be making collectively to better integrate gender into our policy and programs at all levels, because it is not easy. Many of us know that firsthand, but it is absolutely critical to the kind of outcomes we all want to see. You mentioned norms, you mentioned some other areas. Could you give us a little bit more advice, perhaps, on how we might better make greater concerted efforts in this regard?
Yes, thank you. Let me take a few things here. First, I would like to underline that men's violence against women and girls are the most severe violation of human rights. And we can see that this violence has increased during the pandemic, it goes for Sweden and it goes for all over the world. And if you see in the World Health Organization, they see that 1 in 3 women have been subjected to physical or sexual violence. And this just has to stop, and we have to take up this issue. In our budget now, we propose to have a permanent high grant to women's shelter and women's organization, and not ad hoc grants. And I think that's very important. But I also, I said it in my first intervention, but I would like to underline the economic gender equality, because this is so important for so many issues, not only for the justice of it, that women should have the same economic situation as men, but without economic empowerment, it's difficult to be actively involved in society and to be representative in society. It's difficult to be active in peace activity, women, peace and security, if you have to concentrate everything in trying to just have your family and no economic possibilities. And it's also very difficult to leave an abusive relationship if you don't have an economic empowerment. And of course, it's difficult to claim your sexual and reproductive rights. So I think there has been less emphasis on what economic empowerment means for other issues. And here, I think it's important that we go back to gender integration, because if we don't integrate gender systematically and constantly, then we will not see it in, for example, budgeting. And I remember when I was State Secretary for Home Affairs, we had our finance minister, whom I just talked about. She told her state secretary that you are not allowed to start negotiation with any ministry state secretary if they don't have a gender analysis of their proposals. So if we didn't have a gender analysis, and I was for Home Affairs, so it was police and security issues and all those hard issues. If I didn't do a gender analysis, I couldn't even start a discussion with the State Secretary of Finance. I think that's very good, and I think that's a concrete tip. And then finally, we always have to ask the question, are women and girls relevant to this proposal? In what way are they affected? Which gender patterns emerge? What conclusion can we draw? How can we adapt our proposals accordingly? And if we don't do this systematically, and not only on special days or special themes or special persons, we will never achieve change. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to continue now and come back to you, Foreign Minister. But I'm pleased now to welcome Jen Klein, who is the co-chair and executive director of the White House Gender Policy Council. She's carrying out the Biden administration's commitment to advancing gender equality in both the United States, domestic and foreign policies. She has had a distinguished career promoting gender equality both inside and outside government. Previously, the Chief Strategy and Policy Officer at Time's Up, working to combat sexual harassment. She was also an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University Law Center, and she's had a number of previous important roles in government, at which time we were colleagues, when she was deputy and senior advisor in the Office of Global Women's Issues, and then earlier when she worked on a range of critical issues in the Clinton administration in the White House. Jen, it's so great to have you with us today. And perhaps you can illuminate what your job represents, what the administration's effort is to promote a whole of government response to gender equality. You know, I'm wondering, listening to Foreign Minister Linde, whether it is bears any similarity to what Sweden has in its feminist foreign policy. Perhaps you could tell us, what is the mandate of the Gender Policy Council? What are your priorities? A few domestic as well as foreign policy commitments, because we have a large international audience today. And I know that there is considerable interest in your soon to be released government-wide gender strategy to address gender in policies and programs. Can you give us any sense of the timing on that, and perhaps a sense of what you're going to try to do with it?
Yes, thank you, Ambassador Revere, for inviting me to speak with all of you today. And thank you, Minister Linde, for your ongoing leadership on all of these issues. I always find myself listening to you and others from Sweden and feel like I wish I could move there. But I am actually proud to say that, as Milan just referenced, we are really making progress and really putting forward a whole of government approach to gender equity and gender equality in a very exciting and new way. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that today. So, first, it builds on the earlier women's initiatives in both the Obama and Clinton administrations. And this Gender Policy Council that I lead works alongside fellow policy councils, including the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, and of course, the National Security Council, to advance gender equity and equality, and as Milan said, both globally and domestically. We're formally made up of literally virtually every cabinet secretary, each of whom has appointed a senior representative to support the council as we develop a real government-wide approach to gender equality. Since the Gender Policy Council was formally launched this past International Women's Day by the President, we've covered a broad range of issues. I'd say we focused primarily on three high-level priorities, which again are both global and domestic. The first is increasing women's economic security and labor force participation. And of course, part of that is investing in the care economy, which is essential, as you already said, Minister Linde, to ensuring that women are able to participate economically. The second is preventing and responding to gender-based violence wherever it occurs. And the third is advancing women's health. Of course, each of these are key elements to a woman's ability to participate fully in the economy, and underlying each of these is the importance of advancing women's human rights and of ensuring full participation in democracy and society. The executive order, as Milan referenced, that founded this council charges us to develop and implement a whole of government strategy to advance gender equity and equality. And this will be the first ever gender strategy in the US. Our strategic objectives cross both domestic and foreign policy and touch on 10 strategic priorities because, of course, as this audience knows, every issue needs to be approached with a gender lens. So promoting women's leadership is a key part of driving progress across all of these issues. Globally, women continue to be dramatically outnumbered in leadership positions, constituting only a quarter of parliamentary seats around the world. Just 14 countries have gender parity in their national cabinet, and women lead only 22 out of 193 nations. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to ensuring that people are represented equally in public life and at all levels of the federal government, irrespective of gender, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other factors, starting with, of course, our history-making vice president, but also including the record number of diverse women serving in cabinet and senior level roles across the administration. Yet we still have plenty of work to do to reach gender parity in the US. Women fill only a quarter of our own seats in Congress and just 30% of state executive and legislative positions. So in addition to persistent marginalization from leadership in political offices, women across the globe continue to be underrepresented in leadership positions, as you've already referenced, in peace processes, climate negotiations, global health and humanitarian leadership, and in the private sector, despite all the evidence that shows that their participation makes things better, makes peace agreements more sustainable. And of course, women's movements around the world, which have been shown to advance women's power and democratic participation, continue to be grossly underfunded. Promoting women's full participation in leadership roles and ensuring that they are well represented at the tables where decisions are made at every level are a precondition to advancing strong and sustainable democracies, which rest on the promise that all people, regardless of their gender, race, ethnicity, income level, or any other factor, are able to participate fully and equitably in society. As has already been said, and I will just emphasize, advancing women's full participation is not just a moral imperative, which of course it is, it's a strategic one too. The status of women and the stability of nations are inextricably linked. Societies that foster gender discrimination and allow oppressive gender norms to flourish are more likely to be unstable. And by the same token, rising authoritarianism gives rise to and feeds off of growing gender inequality. It's really no accident that these are linked. There's clear evidence that increasing women's political participation and leadership has been proven to promote equality, social welfare policies like education and healthcare, political stability and security. And as Hillary Clinton has said many times, you quoted our vice president, so I'll go on to the next important leader or on all of these issues. A democracy without the full participation of women is a contradiction in terms.
Well, thank you so much, Jen, for telling us about how the White House effort that you're leading is working to close the gap on these issues. And then more broadly, telling us what's at stake. So much is at stake and why this is so critically important. We're going to turn now to another member of the White House staff, Rob Brzezinski, who is the Special Assistant to the President and National Security Council Senior Director for Democracy and Human Rights. He previously served as Senior Vice President for Policy at Human Rights First, where he oversaw that NGO's work to advance U.S. foreign policy rooted in a strong commitment to human rights. He also was a visiting scholar at NYU's program in international relations. Earlier, Rob served in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and before that as Director for Security and Human Rights at the NSC, where many of us worked with Rob on the United States National Action Plan for Women, Peace, and Security, in which he played a pivotal role to make that a reality for this country. So, Rob, it's really wonderful to have you with us today as well. President Biden frequently talks about democracy, how critical it is as the best safeguard we have for human rights, for fundamental freedoms, and for the dignity of every person. You've heard those issues intertwined in everything that has been said so far. But he has also recognized that democracy is under serious threat, both here at home and around the world. Tell us what the administration is doing, what kind of efforts you are working to advance to deal with this democracy recession, because it is a serious eroding of what we all value. What do you hope to achieve, for example, in the upcoming Democracy Summit? Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, and what connection you will be making. We're putting you on the spot here, between gender equality and democracy.
Great. Thanks, Milan. I love to be on the spot. Thank you so much for welcoming me here today. It's really an honor to join my colleague Jen and, of course, Foreign Minister Linde in this event. And you mentioned the work during the Obama administration on the first U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. I will say that the last time I joined Georgetown University in any official capacity, and of course that was back when we could see each other in person, it was for the release of the National Action Plan, which, as you know well, was the same address at which then Secretary of State Clinton announced the creation of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. So I'm really proud to say that I was there with you, Milan, at the creation, and honored that you'd be having me back. So thank you. Now, from that happy place to a bit of less positive news, as you referenced, I'll start by laying bare the challenges we face in the world. In too many places, authoritarians are growing stronger, the rule of law is under assault, and human rights abuses are proliferating. And as you said, in the face of these challenges, President Biden has made very clear that at a moment when democracy at home and abroad is under assault, promoting the equitable and full participation of all people, of all genders, and at all levels of political and civic life is more important than ever. And as each of the speakers before me has mentioned, research demonstrates overwhelmingly that the full political, economic, and societal participation of women and girls is critical to meeting the global challenges we face and essential to the health of democracy. So with all of those facts in mind, President Biden has announced that on December 9th and 10th of this year, he'll gather virtually with a broad and diverse group of world leaders so that together they can announce tangible steps towards how they're going to reinforce democracy and protect human rights. And I would invite everybody around the world that's listening in today. This will all be public in December, and we would love to have you join us for the virtual summit. Moreover, the virtual summit for democracy is going to serve as a launch pad for what we're describing as a year of action that'll lead up to a second leaders summit. And over the course of that year, we very much expect that those invited to the virtual summit will follow through on the commitments they make. Foreign Minister Linde beat me to the punch in terms of Vice President Harris's wonderful words, but I'll just repeat them again for our audience that, quote, "The status of women is the status of democracy." And through the summit and more broadly through U.S. foreign policy, the Biden administration is pursuing two overarching objectives to foster the agency of women and girls in all their diversity as a force for democratic change. First, we're working with partners to build a safe environment for women and girls to participate freely in politics and in public life, including in fragile contexts, in peace processes, and in democratic transitions. As we all know, women still face a multitude of barriers to engaging in public life, such as the lack of access to education and economic resources, political corruption and discriminatory legal frameworks, sociocultural attitudes and gender norms, and of course, violence and harassment. And when these barriers to gender equality and women's empowerment are mitigated and removed, we know, as each of the speakers before me has indicated, that we foster stronger and more inclusive democracies. And the US government continues to lead the charge in this regard. I'll just give one data point. USAID, our development agency, remains the leading humanitarian donor for gender-based violence prevention and response efforts worldwide. In 2020 alone, USAID provided nearly $100 million globally to support 3.3 million people in 27 countries around the world with GBV prevention and response services. Second, we're also working to empower women and girls to exercise their civic and political rights. And I'll associate myself with everything Jen said in this regard. We're advancing women's rights and participation in public life because we know that that's associated with better governance, lower levels of corruption, and greater peace and prosperity. And ultimately, empowering women and girls as leaders isn't just a moral imperative. It'll also, we know, improve our collective ability to address some of the biggest challenges of our time, President Biden's priorities, everything from the climate crisis to the COVID crisis at local, regional, national, and international levels. And so through the Summit for Democracy, we want to expand this space in every way we can. That means engaging with other government participants in the summit on reforms and initiatives they can undertake in their own laws and policies, such as drafting their own country strategies and action plans on combating gender-based violence, or developing laws to close the pay gap and ensure all people have comprehensive sick and parental leave. Without getting too far ahead of our own internal governmental process, I hope it also means being able to make important new announcements about how the US government will expand its support for women's and girls' civic and political leadership through US foreign assistance. And finally, has been alluded to by my colleagues on the panel, it means modeling equitable participation in the summit itself. Now, Jen threw out the stat, I believe that only 22 world leaders around the world are women. So when you're talking about bringing heads of state together in an event like this, there are obviously some challenges. But in terms of agenda setting and thinking about participation in the summit more broadly, where we're bringing in not just national leaders, but also cabinet leaders and local officials and members of civil society and the business sector, equal participation and modeling are very much on our minds and something that we hope people will walk away from the summit remarking upon. So let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob, for laying out that tall agenda. It really is a tall order, and hopefully much of it will be achieved. Minister Linde, I want to come back to you and pick up where Rob left off in terms of democracy and gender equality and the attacks on both today. Women's political participation, as we've been hearing, I know is something near and dear to your heart and something critically important in all the venues in which you operate, and yet it's constrained in much of the world, and the statistics that Jen laid out are less than positive in terms of where we need to be. Similarly, the pushback, for example, the Istanbul Convention, the de-ratifying that's going on, the terrible efforts being made against addressing domestic violence, for example. What more can we do? What's our call to action, if you will, on how to enhance women's participation, democratic participation, because it's so critically important in dealing with these threats?
Thank you very much, Melaine. Well, there are a few things we can do. For example, I think this issue of having separate lists or several lists on political, when you have elections, to any political gathering at local, regional or central level is important. And that also changed the attitudes. I know that when I was in Canada at a progressive meeting with Justin Trudeau, they said, why do you have 50-50 in the government? And he said, because it's 2015. And then I said, well, we had that since 1994. So what I think is good that if you set a pace that becomes universal, so that different political parties don't think it's something very special then you have reached a long way. So now, since 1994, all governments in Sweden has been 50-50 when it comes to men and women in the government, irrespectively of what color of the government. And I think that's important. I also think it's very important to have women leadership education, so to speak, because there is really a need for letting women get the feeling that it's okay to take place, that their voices should be heard, to have mentorships, and to support women organizations. And also here, I want to underline the need for economic gender equality, because if you have a unequal in the family, both when it comes to the possibility to have a job, a paid job, but also when it comes to take care of the family, there is less time to take part in politics. That's why I think that there are 3 reforms that have been especially important for us. One is that we gave up taxation on family. Instead, we have taxation on individual. Meaning that you don't put the extra money that the woman got in her on top. That's very important. The other is affordable childcare. Universal and affordable childcare, extremely important to get women to both get a job, but also to have political participation. And here is also elderly care, because in many societies, it's the women who take care of their elderly parents, and I don't have time to go in the political meetings and so on. And the final thing is parental leave. And I know that's also something that the Democratic administration is working for. We are consistently discussing how we can do this better. We have parental leave, 13 months with paid salary, but it's not equally distributed between men and women. Now the fathers have to take 3 months, but they don't have to take half of it, and they don't do. And that is what I really see as a goal. So both family issues, economic, gender equality, and specific measures in politics itself, I think it's important to get more politically active women. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's really excellent that we need both the political reforms, but we also need to understand the link with domestic policies to actually make it easier for women to participate more significantly. So Jen, let's move to you on that score as well. Perhaps give us a couple of recommendations on what can be done to enhance women's participation in democracy. And will your office be significantly involved in the Democracy Summit?
So the answer to the last question is yes. And as you can hear, Rob and I are already working really closely together. And I'm grateful for him every day. But as I was listening to you, Rob, I was even more grateful for your partnership, because you don't necessarily assume that an NSC is going to be as committed to gender equality as this one is, and particularly in the form of you. So thank you. And I'll focus on a few things. I mean, I would just say that everything that the foreign minister just said are really the things that we need to do. And I'm back to thinking I want to move to Sweden because, you know, real time here, while you are talking about your 13-month paid family and medical leave, that's available in Sweden. We are, trying hard to fight for 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave here in the United States. And to your point, that and childcare and many other parts of what we have come to term the care economy are essential not only to getting women and families and people to work, and we've seen that completely during COVID, but also to participate fully in their society and in democracy. So, thank you for making that connection, because it is so clear and so obvious. And I will say, here in the United States, I don't think it's always been, that connection has always been made as much as it should. So turning to things that, as I said, haven't really been covered, I just want to make sure that we note the importance of legal change. So, literally, equity and equality under the law is a precondition to women's full participation in economic, political, social, and cultural life. And as we know, 100 nations still have laws on the books that inhibit women's workplace participation, their freedom of movement, and their equality in various different ways. And on average, women around the world are entitled to only 3/4 of the rights that men enjoy, and in many nations, far less than that. So in order to ensure meaningful participation and full participation in society, we really have to first enshrine gender equity and gender equality in the law, again, here in the United States and around the world. And importantly, to make sure that rights on paper are fully implemented in practice. So I'd say, number one, legal change. Number two, and Rob really started to talk about this also, is addressing bias or harassment and violence, including when people are exercising their right to participate in democracy and political, and civic life, including in women's roles as activists, human rights defenders, and political leaders. Around the world, again, we've seen this in recent days. Women in these roles face disproportionate threats of violence, including on the basis of gender. Women who are simply trying to exercise their right to vote are nearly 4 times more likely to fall victim to violence than men, while women campaigning for or serving in political office face elevated risks of violence, including threats of sexual assault. They also face disproportionate harassment, including denigrating comments on their physical appearance, and they're subject to social norms that continue to stifle their political aspirations and leadership opportunities. A recent UN report noted that almost 50% of people globally, both men and women, interestingly, feel that men make better political leaders. So in addition to the very important legal changes we need to make, we need to focus on the norms that perpetuate bias and discrimination. We know that the threat of violence and harassment have kept women from politics. It's actually led to, literal physical consequences, from Joe Cox, a British parliamentarian and outspoken advocate for women's rights, to Marielle Franco, a Black feminist city councilor in Rio and an advocate for LGBTQI+ rights, both of whom were assassinated in broad daylight. So these are, very real, very horrible consequences of this lack of safety and this perpetuation of violence against women who are trying to be involved in democracy. As I said earlier, that requires a multifaceted approach, and we've touched on a lot of it. It includes promoting women's participation in peace processes and negotiations, including through our women, peace, and security efforts. It includes investing in women and girls' leadership and movements, and ending gender-based violence wherever it occurs, on or offline. And again, not to tip the hat too much on the Democracy Summit, one of the things that we are working on closely is thinking about that online harassment that is used very specifically to target, in many ways, of course, but very specifically also to target women in political life. As the Foreign Minister said, the summit really provides a great opportunity to draw the connection between gender equity, gender equality and democracy, also between economic growth and security and political stability, and to make real commitments. And we are really looking forward to working with so many of the people who are on this Zoom, to you, Milan, to you, Foreign Minister, and of course, within the US government to get started.
Thank you, Jen, for those really good points. And I'm very happy that you raised a very unhappy topic, which is the jeopardy that we confront as politicians and increased violence, whether it's physical violence or online violence. So I'm happy to hear that the summit may be confronting that as well, because it's a serious, serious problem. Rob, can you finish off this initial panel discussion in terms of adding whatever you'd like to what the minister and Jen said about how women's political participation, democratic participation can be enhanced for the flourishment of democracy, which is something we all want to see.
Absolutely, and keeping to one of the subtopics of the day, I'm gonna answer that question in part, Milan, by talking a little bit more about some of the Summit for Democracy's focus areas. Of course, the reason I do so is because they're indicative of the priorities of the Biden-Harris administration from a foreign policy perspective, and I just want to kind of draw a few connections to gender as I go along. So the four I'll mention in terms of our larger democracy renewal agenda are fighting corruption, strengthening civic and political participation, supporting free and independent media, and then lastly, and this relates directly to what Jen was mentioning, harnessing technology for democracy. So let me start with the fight against corruption. Some may know that a few months ago, President Biden issued what was really a first of its kind in terms of a national security study memorandum. That's our official bureaucratese for a very important document that established fighting corruption as a core U.S. national security interest. We know that corruption disproportionately affects vulnerable populations and hits the poor the hardest, especially women. And it also includes various forms of non-monetary exploitation. When people think corruption, they may think bribery, but there are forms of non-monetary exploitation that include gender-based violence. So in order to reduce corruption, we want to foster an operating environment for civil society, folks like investigative journalists, and other oversight and watchdog groups that are focused on the intersection of corruption and gender issues. So to kind of make this real, to give one example, the State Department, the bureau that I used to work for, focused on human rights at the State Department, is supporting local partners in Sri Lanka who are holding workshops on gender-based violence with a particular focus on awareness of sexual bribery, what's known as sextortion, and offering training on how vulnerable groups can build their resilience to that particular form of corruption and abuse. In terms of the second priority, strengthening civic and political participation of all people, I mean, that's very much the wheelhouse of what we've been talking about today. So through this line of effort, we are supporting local and regional women activists and women's rights organizations around the world in growing their networks and advocating for needed policy reforms and holding governments accountable, running for political office. And once they get into office, how to govern effectively, influence policy, and attain leadership positions. Third, on investing in a robust and independent media, given the changes we've seen in the global media environment over the course of the last 10, 15 years, almost exclusively negatively, we are working to improve the financial viability of independent media, which is really the lifeblood of democratic societies, to bolster the resilience of outlets and citizen journalists, expose and counteract disinformation, and defend and protect journalists online and off, including women journalists. And as we undertake this work, we're thinking deliberately about how we can raise up women's voices. So to again use a specific illustration. We're doing things like supporting radio programs in countries like Colombia that are geared towards enabling marginalized women to call in and talk about their needs and their proposals for local development. And then fourth and last, we're bolstering strong human rights standards concerning the use of technology that is impacting democracies and non-democracies alike at breathtaking pace around the world. That means things like protecting against highly intrusive artificial intelligence enabled surveillance technology, supporting digital safety of human rights activists online, and also promoting how new and emergent technologies can be used to make governments more efficient and responsive to their citizens. And in every aspect of this, what we're trying to do is increase women and girls' access to and safe use of information and communications technology and social media as a tool for engaging with and organizing others, including through programs that relate to, say, digital literacy and digital hygiene training. So you may hear U.S. government officials talking about topics like these, like digital repression and corruption, and saying, well, what does that have to do with women's empowerment and gender? And I hope just kind of providing some of these examples demonstrates in a very real way the extent to which the U.S. government is taking the idea of mainstreaming gender considerations into various elements of our policy and our programming really across the board.
Oh, that's very important to hear how all of these dimensions really link to gender equality. I know the OSCE, one of the sections of the OSCE is looking precisely at the impacts of corruption on women, which is not, as you well said, often understood. We're almost at the end point, but I want to take at least an audience question to bring them into this discussion. Allie, can you tell us what is on that list of many questions, I'm sure?
Sure. One question that's echoed by others. This one's from Lizzie Bajan-Sharp. She's a student at the University of Bristol. She's asking, what do you think are some of the most effective ways to ensure all women, not just women of privilege, are meaningfully included and promoted within democratic institutions? How do we ensure a diversity of women at the table that includes youth, women of color, and others?
Minister, do you want to lead the way here, as always?
Yeah, thank you. Well, those are the things I think that we have pinpointed in. One is that you have a systematic gender perspective in absolutely everything. That is the most baked in. I always say, put your gender glasses on, and you find gender issues and discrimination in absolutely everything from taking away snow from the streets. Yes. At the next meeting, I will tell you how there can be a gender analysis of taking away snows from the streets, till how difficult it is to get salaries that is equal. And in all countries, there is not one single country where you have equal salaries, and the economic empowerment, as we have come back to, is so important. I also very much think that you need to have if not quotas, at least representation. We talk about 3R: resources, representation, rights. And you have to put all those things in everything you do. Otherwise, you will not get gender parity and women at the table, in the political discussions. And that is ultimately the goal, to have everybody to have a say and everything to be inclusive.
I'm afraid we're going to leave it at that. I apologize to Jen and to Rob, but we are over time. And I can't thank you enough. I think that last edict, put on your gender glasses, is a good one for all of us when it comes to integrating gender into all of these critical issues that we've been discussing today. Thank you for the lessons that you have imparted to us, for the plans and the leadership that has gone into this discussion in terms of what it represents for the future, and for your example and inspiration. So Minister Linde, it has been wonderful to have you with us, and thank you to Sweden for leading the way with the feminist foreign policy and for all that you are doing. And to Jen Klein and to Rob Brzezinski, thank you to both of you for illuminating what the Biden administration is really working hard to do on these issues. To all of our audience, thank you for being with us. We have a lot of work ahead of us, all of us, but I'm sure that with commitment, we will continue to move forward. Thanks so much.